The Dayton Accords played a key role in ending the Bosnian War. It managed to settle border disputes and officially end hostilities in Bosnia. In 1989, Slobodan Milosevic, who was the Serbian prime minister at that time, delivered a speech intending to put an end to the special status that Kosovo and Vojvodina had enjoyed in the Republic of Serbia for years. However, the speech ended up disrupting internal relations and causing the division of Yugoslavia. Because of this, it proved itself to be a failure in diplomacy. Bosnia-Herzegovina followed Serbia and Croatia in the act of declaring independence from Yugoslavia. It made the announcement on March 3, 1992, and the beautiful country had no idea of all the horrors that would soon follow. Shortly after breaking off from Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina was both flung into a civil war and invaded by Serbia because of territorial ambitions. In the war, Serbs committed numerous atrocities, which introduced the label ethnic cleansing into everyday vocabulary. During the early part of the war, the president of the UN Security Council formally demanded that the fighting in Bosnia and Herzegovina stop immediately. On May 5, 1992, he issued a statement which, quote, demands that all parties and others concerned in Bosnia and Herzegovina stop the fighting immediately and cooperate with the efforts of the European community to bring about urgently a negotiated political solution respecting the principle that any change of the borders by force is not acceptable. End quote. One of the worst massacres of the war occurred in the town of Srebrenica. Serb troops captured Srebrenica on July 11, 1995, and the lightly armed soldiers protecting the town had no hope of fending off the attack. After separating the men from the women and children, who were sent away on buses and trucks, the Serbs began performing mass executions. Over 7,000 Bosniak men were executed in only a matter of days. Even 15 years after the massacre, people are still mourning. How can you forget, says Ramiza Gerdic, a woman who lost her husband along with both of her sons. I go to bed with the pain and I wake up with the sadness. A leading Bosnian Serb political leader shares her thoughts on the war.
At the time, I easily convinced myself that this was a matter of survival and self-defense. In fact, it was more. Our leadership, of which I was a necessary part, led an effort which victimized countless innocent people. By the end, it was said, even among our own people, that in this war we had lost our nobility of character.
The effects of the war on victims will last a lifetime.
And then he turned to us, Croats, and he started speaking to us. Listen, you guys, we're going to kill all of you. We're going to burn you all. We're going to throw your ashes into the Danube to destroy your Croat seed. I remember exactly that sentence, and I shall never forget it.
One victim's testimony seems irrelevant at first, but soon becomes shockingly clear.
I have a weak heart. It is so bad. My feet went numb while I've been sitting here. I have nothing to hope for. This mother cannot take it much longer. You will see. I will die of sadness and sorrow. My husband is also sick and he cries often. He hides from me when he cries, but then I follow him and then we cry. What can we do? I would just like to ask Dragan to tell me where they are, in which mass grave, so that their mother could give them a dignified funeral. I want to give them a proper burial and then I can go away myself.
The bombing of a small marketplace finally caught the attention of the United States.
The Serbs bombed the marketplace in Sarajevo and killed 38 people. This was a bridge too far.
The United States finally saw the severity of the war and the extreme need for a serious effort at peace. However, the Dayton Accords would not be the first attempt to regain peace. By July of 1995, over 40 ceasefire agreements had been signed by different ethnic groups in Bosnia. The UN had reached around 30 ceasefire agreements as well. However, these were ignored and the war continued with increasing severity. Croatian President Franjo Tuđman and Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović were gathered and sent to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, along with Richard Holbrooke and a team of American diplomats. Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic represented the Bosnian Serbs in the negotiations, for their leaders were war criminals prohibited from the discussions. The negotiations were most certainly long, hard, and frustrating for all those involved. To help achieve the greatest progression in the shortest amount of time, leaders enforced a complete media blackout. Once the negotiations started, there was no turning back. Richard Holbrooke was an essential player in the negotiation of the Dayton Accords. NPR News explores how his negotiating style helped the peace agreement become a success.
Negotiations themselves are a little bit like jazz. You improvise on a theme and you move towards a goal.
That was Richard Holbrooke in 1998, discussing his orchestration of the Bosnian Peace Accords, agreed in Dayton, Ohio. After many days of hard work, the Dayton Accords were finally signed on December 14, 1995, and officially ended the war in Bosnia. Much debate is aroused on the topic of the military versus civilian provisions of the Dayton Accords. Besides tasks such as separating the forces and destroying ammunition dumps, the agreement says very little about the military aspects. Most mentions of civilian implementation as it regards the IFOR are stated as vague phrases which essentially allow the military to fulfill its tasks on request and within the limits provided. The Dayton Accords were both a success and a failure. While it did accomplish its main task, ending the war in Bosnia, it failed to create a truly unified nation. One of the most serious flaws was the fact that it left two opposing armies in one country. Since NATO would not disarm either army as an obligated task, the formation of a single unified army was not possible. The agreement also fails to mandate the arrest of war criminals. The Dayton Accords hand over this responsibility to the three signing parties. On the Croatian and Serb side, only a couple of low-level criminals have been produced. Commanders of the NATO-led stabilization force ignore this and label it as a failure of the civilian provision. Diane Onrenlager hypothesizes why SFOR commanders were so hesitant to bring war criminals to justice in an interview with NPR News.
Once the peace was established, NATO forces in Bosnia had the authority to arrest war criminals and made a judgment that it was too risky, that it would be destabilizing. I wasn't in the position of having to mount an operation, so it's easy from afar to be critical. But in retrospect, I think many people, including people who served in the armed forces at that time, think that they made a miscalculation.
Richard Holbrooke mentions other mistakes that managed to slip by the architects at Dayton in an interview with NPR News in 2005.
The three armies were a mistake. It's well on its way to fixing. Ethnically based police were a mistake. That's also on its way to being fixed. The central government is too weak, and that's what's at issue here. And finally, on the list of mistakes, the three presidents.
Annex 3 of the Dayton Accords allows Bosnians to participate in democratic voting, much like Americans do. This gives citizens the chance to rebuild their lives without the hate and violence that held the young nation in its grasp for so long. However, some citizens still wish to return to the hate-filled lives that they are used to. This fact was strongly displayed by the rioting that occurred when Ratko Mladic, the general responsible for the massacre at Srebrenica, was to be handed over to the UN Security Council. It seems to show that the conflict in Bosnia is not truly over.